Okay. It's, it's as well balanced as the Middle East. Everything's okay? Very good. Um, I'll try to give a broad picture about the Middle East and Israel because one of the problems is that we are focusing on certain issues, such as the latest war that we've had in Gaza. And I'm not saying we shouldn't study it, but we are sometimes very knowledgeable about what happened recently, but we are losing the big picture. And one of the problems is that the journalistic coverage of the Middle East, even when it's not hostile, and it's very often hostile, it is so superficial that you can't understand what is really going on there. We have this proverbial journalist who comes to the Middle East for 3 days, and then he writes a book called The Middle East, Yesterday, Today, Tomorrow. You have this perception that everything can be understood. Just let the Israelis and the Palestinians make peace with each other, and then everybody in the Middle East will ride into the sunset and live happily ever after. And these perceptions that are particularly accepted by the media, but also, unfortunately, when you speak to people who call themselves experts on the Middle East, present a challenge for us to understand the broader picture and the deeper picture. And when you do understand it, however depressing it may be, and I promise you I'll be very depressing this evening, however depressing it may be, at least you will not say there is no logic in the Middle East. The logic is different than our logic. The logic needs to be studied because we are speaking about a completely different culture. But once you understand the way it works, you're much less surprised about what will happen. I must say, I've made in my time a lot of predictions about the Middle East, and the overwhelming majority of them came true, not because I'm so smart, and I am, but also because once you understand the way things work, you will not very often be surprised. Because you understand the mechanism, you understand how one thing leads to another. And I will also today not only speak about today's reality and yesterday's legacy, but also about what we can expect in the near future. Unfortunately, not very positive, but at least much more understandable than I think you will usually feel when you look at the descriptions that are very common in this society. And I was asked today to speak not just about the Middle East, but about the Middle East with an Israeli perspective. And I will primarily discuss what I will consider a paradox. On the one hand, from an Israeli point of view, practically everything looks bad, is getting worse, and will definitely be even worse than today. Okay? All the trajectories are extremely negative on almost all fields. On the other hand, the ability of Israel to cope with these difficulties is growing faster than the difficulties themselves. So in the final analysis, I'm very optimistic about the pessimistic situation, not because it's good and getting better, but because however bad it gets, we can take it. To a very large extent, this is based on our experience in the past. But once you understand the mechanisms, you will also be able to make a prediction about the future that will be, again, very pessimistic when it comes to the challenges that Israel faces, and very optimistic concerning the ability of Israel to find responses. And let me stress, not solutions, responses. If there is one thing we need to learn right from the very beginning about the Middle East, if you're looking for solutions, find the crossword puzzle. There is nothing that has solutions. I mean, everything important in life doesn't have solutions. A few people here are married, so they should know from personal experience. There are certain things that don't have solutions. For instance, poverty doesn't have a solution. Crime doesn't have a solution. There will always be poverty. We had one ideology that promised us that there will not be poverty. It was called communism, and we know exactly how well it worked. Crime doesn't have a solution, because if you work very hard for something, somebody else wants to take it away from you without working very hard. It's human nature, okay? I mean, we just have to look up the best reference I can think of, the Bible. The moment you have two people, more than two people in the world, one of them kills the other. It's called fraternal relations. I mean, these people were brothers, right? So you don't have solutions. If you have this mind of an engineer and you believe that every problem has solutions, you should become a journalist. But if you want to be intelligent about things and you want to understand how things work, start understanding that at best you can get an effective response that will deal with a problem and bring it down from an unacceptable level that you cannot live with to an acceptable level that you can live with. This is what we do with poverty. This is what we do with crime. If everything functions very well, we bring it down to a level we can learn to live with. When you come to the Middle East and you speak about solutions, you must then have an extremely developed sense of humor. So I'm not speaking about what are the Israeli solutions. We live in an area that is very problematic. I don't know if you've heard about this very interesting conversation when the angels came to the Almighty and said to him, "You were so nice to the Jews. You have promised them your love. You have promised them that you'll never leave them. You have promised them a great future. It's unfair to other nations." And God says, "Wait until you see what neighbors I've given them." Okay? So you look at this region, you see how Arabs treat other Arabs in the Middle East, and you ask yourself, can you expect the Arabs to treat the Jews better than they treat each other? And then if you're an Israeli and you look at the Middle East, you stop being cheerful. This is a cure once and for all for cheerfulness when you come to this region. But to quote Winston Churchill, a cheerful disposition is not the sole qualification for a prophet. So if you want to understand what's happening there, leave your cheerfulness. If you have this American malaise, namely a terminal case of optimism, leave it at home when you come to deal with the Middle East. Don't bring democracy to the Arab world, either with the Marines, like George Bush, or with a nice speech in Cairo, like the next president. Look at the Middle East, see the fundamental problems, and with some humility, I know it sounds strange coming from me, with some humility, you look at this region and you try to understand the problems and then navigate in a way where you can minimize the damage. This is the best you can get. Now let me tell you something from an Israeli point of view about our regional environment, and it's all bad. There is a single positive thing that I'm about to say about the regional environment. The only good thing I can say is that today is better than tomorrow. I mean, wait until you see what develops next, and you will feel that today was relatively good. Look on the international level from an Israeli point of view, and with one exception that I will dwell on later, again, you will see only negative things. And then the question is, how do you deal with it? Let me start with the Middle East, the immediate environment, regional environment of Israel, and say something with great sadness. I wish I can gloat, but the joke is on us, so I'm not gloating. I'm looking at the Arab world, and I'm saying something with great sadness. And by the way, I've been saying it for decades, but until 15 years ago, in the Arab world, when you follow the political literature in the Arab world and the discourse in the Arab world, in the Arab world, this was not accepted. In the last 15 years, Arabs will admit that this is true about the Middle East, what I'm about to say now, as sad as it may sound. The Middle East is structurally unstable, violent, and if we've learned this new term in the last few decades, we used to think until a few decades ago that if a state doesn't function, it ceases to exist. Since then, we've learned that there is such a thing as failed states. In the Middle East, most Arab states are very close to becoming failed states, and the whole region may be called one day a failed region. And again, I'm not saying it as an Israeli gloating over Arabs. I'm saying we are stuck in the middle of it, so I wish it were different. I would be delighted if I could see the great hope in the Middle East. Very few serious Arabs see this hope, and I don't see it at all. And let me try to explain two dimensions of this problem and the effect it has on Israel. First of all, in the last 200 years, the Arabs have tried to deal with the challenge of the West in this region, in the Middle East, and tried to find their own way into modernity without losing the attachment to their culture. Now, this is possible. Look at the Japanese. They have not given away their culture. They're very different than other cultures, but they're dealing with the modern world in a very effective way. So it doesn't mean you have to stop being a Muslim or stop being an Arab if you successfully deal with the challenges of the modern world. By and large, this attempt has failed. Have we seen a few cases of success? Yes, but if you look at the overall picture, by and large, it has failed. And very interestingly, on the eve of the new millennium, there were hundreds of fascinating articles throughout the Arab world written about this subject, with a willingness to admit that was not there 20, 30 years ago. We have tried and we have failed. We cannot deal with the 21st century. We're not equipped to deal with the 21st century. And here is the reason. The Arabs used to have a traditional social order that may not have functioned very well, but it functioned. And then came the West, and they tried to find a way of bringing together their own traditional ways with the Western ways. And they failed. So the old ways are not there anymore, and the new social order they couldn't accept, and what they're getting is a limbo between two social orders, neither here nor there. And again, they are lamenting about it throughout the Arab world. What we have is a very major case where an attempt to adopt a different social order that will somehow bring together in a functional way both ways of life did not succeed. And again, I'm saying it with great sadness, because you will see in a moment the negative effect also about Israel, not only if you look from an Arab perspective, but also from an Israeli perspective. And what we have is a situation that, with few exceptions, two good examples of these exceptions are Egypt and Morocco. There are others, but these are two major interesting exceptions. What you have today in the Arab world is not modern nation states. What you have are tribes that conglomerate people together. Syria is a conglomerate. Lebanon is a conglomerate. Iraq is a conglomerate. In other words, you have different groups, and a common basis has not been found. So what you've seen today, what you see today, every day in Syria, is not new. This is Syria. Assad's father killed 30,000 people in one event around the city of Hama in 1982. Assad's son killed more than 30,000 people in 2 years. But basically, if you get a different regime in Syria, they will be butchering different kinds of populations. This is Syria. Again, I'm sorry to say, this is Lebanon. Look at the civil war in Lebanon, and the civil war in Syria, and the civil war in Yemen, and the civil war in the Sudan, and the civil war in Libya. Look, and wherever you want in the Middle East, and see what you're getting. The only countries where you don't have a civil war is where the regime is so brutal and so strong that it prevents it by force. And then it will erupt, as it erupted in Syria after 40, 50 years of relative stability. The stability is only oppression. This is what you get there. We have yet to see, some people hope that it's beginning now. I don't believe in it, but about the future, you know, predictions are very difficult, particularly those concerning the future. But let's speak about everything we know. Everything we know is that so far the attempts have failed. Now, Egypt is different, Morocco is different. Societies sometimes change their political cultures. It's a possibility. It could happen in the Arab world as well. But, when it starts, it takes generations to produce results, not years, generations to produce results. And what we see recently is not even the development in the right direction. What we have, in addition to this structural instability with a very high level of violence, is a very radical ideology, the Islamist ideology. And again, let me emphasize, this is not Islam. I don't know anything about Islam. I know what specific Muslims that I have studied considers Islam to be in a certain time and a certain place. Islam in the Arab world is very different from Islam in Indonesia and in Bangladesh. Remember, in Indonesia we have 250 million Muslims. Okay? It's also a few Muslims. But you have much less radicalism, dramatically less radicalism than in the Arab world. Look at Bangladesh. Okay? 3 times free elections. Impressive. First time free elections is easy. This is what Bernard Lewis called the system of one man, one vote, one time. Okay? Once you're in power, it's over. 3 times is different. And we've seen it. And it's impressive. Would I like to live in Bangladesh? No, thank you. But is it impressive? Yes. So it's not Islam. Islam can be this, Islam can be that. Look at Iran. Iran is Muslim, Shiite. They have a barbaric regime by any yardstick that you can possibly imagine. But they have a pluralistic society. If tomorrow you have a change of regime in Iran, my hopes are very, very high because the society is pluralistic. The alternative to the regime is a much better reality than before. In the Arab world, when you have repulsive regimes, the alternative sometimes can even be worse. And we'll see after what's happened in what they call the Arab Spring now. Unfortunately, I think that the choice of words was very unfortunate. I think Vivaldi would have to reconsider at least one of the chapters of the 4 Seasons. If this is spring, I don't want to know what winter is. So you get a situation where radicals have taken over. Now, don't misunderstand me. Radicals can be pragmatic. Not only can be pragmatic, every radical without an exception can behave pragmatically. Hitler was a bit of a radical, I believe, wasn't he? In München, he behaved pragmatically because he saw the British are willing to capitulate, so he pragmatically agreed. Does it make him less of a radical? No. The fact that somebody can behave pragmatically doesn't mean that he is not a very extreme radical. And Islamism is radical in its core. And what it promises is what counts. We're used to say, well, there are words and deeds, and what counts is deeds. In the Middle East, words produce deeds because you commit yourself to certain words, and then you can't afford for a very long time to do things that are against the normative commitments that you have made. We have seen it in the Middle East again and again and again. We see leaders doing the extreme opposite of what they want because they've committed themselves to a very radical ideology. This is what happened to Gamal Abdel Nasser in 1967. He didn't want war. Between 61 and 67, he tried whatever he could to prevent war. But finally, his own ideologies that he promoted made him take steps that led to provocations that made the war inevitable. So what we're getting is a very dangerous situation, particularly when we look at what is called the Arab street. This is the most irresponsible and radical force in the Arab world, where people go out in the street and demand the most radical action, and anybody who's not extremely violent, trying to destroy everything around him, is considered a CIA or a Mossad agent. By the way, if the Mossad had as many agents as the Arabs say we have agents, first of all, it would be much lovelier because we get much more information. And second, the Mossad would go belly up because we would be bankrupt. We can't pay for so many people. But everybody who is not the most extreme radical, fanatic, and irresponsible is accused of being an agent of Mossad or of the CIA. And finally, the people who want to do the right thing because they understand the constraints end up doing what they have promised to do. So you look at the Middle East, you look for something for a silver lining, no silver lining. Let's, if you're not depressed enough, I'm still working on it, look at the international arena. With one exception, a tremendously important exception, the United States. We'll speak about it in a minute. Whatever happens in the international arena is extremely negative. International organizations become more and more important, primarily because the Europeans made them important. They say we take our moral cue from international organizations. And in the international organizations, practically all of them, 80% of their agenda is being anti-Israeli. This becomes, you want to be international is undermining the very existence of Israel. I mean, look at the United Nations. It's an insult, okay? In the United Nations, I'm only expecting that they should blame Israel for killing the Dead Sea. I know they're working on it. I mean, we're next to it. It's dead. We must be responsible for it. And automatically, you have 130 countries who will vote for it because it says that the Jews are illegitimate as a national collective. And every international organization, because the majority of countries sitting there are non-democratic regimes, sometimes as barbaric as Sudan or Gaddafi's Libya, they sit on human rights committees and they determine the international norms. And the international norms undermine everything that they should work for. And in these organizations, the situation of Israel is it's hopeless. Automatically, almost always, this is what they deal with. They don't do anything very often except blaming Israel for practically everything. In addition to it, we have a very serious problem in Europe. It is a combination of radical liberalism, Puritanist liberalism, that is basically undermining the right of civilized people to defend themselves against barbarians. Because the notion is, under no circumstances whatsoever should you use force. And then, anybody who provokes you will be given immunity from any response if, God forbid, you listen to the Europeans. So there's no danger. Israel doesn't listen to Europe. When we are uncertain about what we need to do, we ask the Europeans what to do, we do the opposite, it always works, okay? But the fact that today in Europe, the elites are becoming more and more anti-Israeli to the point where if you look today at European media, they lie in every news bulletin in a major way, and people know they're lying and they want them to lie for them against Israel. And here is the interesting thing. Governments in Europe are not hostile. In all of Europe, most governments are either friendly or open-minded. And only 4 countries in Europe are really unfriendly or hostile to Israel: Sweden, Norway, Ireland, sometimes Spain. But the governments, I've recently been in 16 different European countries speaking to the top officials of these countries and to decision makers, and very often they tell me, you don't understand. I understand the analysis you're bringing me, and you're right, I totally support it. But if I will say it in public, I will lose my legitimacy vis-à-vis my own elite. The problem is today in the European elites, a combination of anti-Semitism and the European urge to commit cultural suicide and to delegitimize the use of force makes it impossible for Israel in most democratic states to get a fair hearing about its attitude. Now again, it still works with the governments, but even the governments cannot control their elites, and the result is that we are going in a negative direction. Last but not least, the United States is perceived throughout the world as weak, weakening, and even declining. Now, I disagree with this perspective. I don't believe the United States must decline. My perception is that there is something profoundly healthy in the American people, and America has the capability of reinventing itself. And the United States is in a problem, in a crisis now, but it will re-emerge as the only country that can lead the world. But the perception of American weakness, because there is such a strong association between Israel and the United States, is very worrying. And if you speak to the allies of the United States, you will find that they're all worried. And if you'll speak to the enemies of the United States, you will find they're all elated. And that's a very serious problem in itself. So far, the bad news. But you shouldn't expect me now to come to the good news, because when it comes to Jews, there are bad news and not so bad news. The possibility of saying, now the good news, reminds me of this great story about the Komsomol under Brezhnev's time, where somebody comes to the Komsomol and says, comrades, I have bad news and good news. First, the bad news, the Chinese have landed on the moon. Now the good news, all of them. I have nothing that is in any way similar to that. I mean, I'm not about to say, if somebody is depressed, please savor this, because you'll need it. You should be depressed. But the question is, how do you make what the military calls and intelligence calls net assessment? Namely, not only looking at what threatens you, but also factoring in what you can do about it. If you say the enemy has so and so many cannons, and if he shoots all these cannons at us, we will be dead, you should also say, okay, they have cannons, but we have anti-cannon missiles. And we've devised a missile that, goes about and looks for a cannon, and when it finds a cannon, it goes there and they reach out and touch somebody. So net assessment is combining what you're facing with what you can do about it. And here comes the not so bad news. Starting with the United States. Yes, Israel is isolated. Yes, there is only one country we can more or less trust. But this country happens to be the United States. That's not bad. You know, when you have one country, and between the Marshall Islands and the United States, you can choose the United States, not bad. And the most important thing, I'm going to meet on Monday Professor Marsheimer, and I hope completely dismantle his whole approach. This doesn't come because the Jewish lobby, I've read the protocols of the elders of AIPAC, and, they control the United States. By the way, I wish it were true. Wouldn't it be fun to control the world? It's great. And sometimes when people believe in it, I stop fighting against it. I say, hey, you shouldn't be giving us problems. We control the world. But there is something much more fundamental. if you want to be serious. APEC can be a great collection of salesmen, but you can't sell a product that is not excellent for 65 years, every year, to the majority of the people. Okay? The product, yours truly and a few others, is great. And because it's great, and because Americans believe it to be great, the salesman can be doing such an excellent job, and they're doing an excellent job. You have more than 60% at every given minute of Americans who support Israel. That's unbelievable. Most people don't know what Israel is, okay? But still 60% support it. And that's an enormous ratio. And it comes from something that is not going away. Namely, you have a very similar ethos between the Americans and the Israelis. These are the only two nations on earth that are committed to liberty, are open societies, and also have a spinal cord, and also have a spine. Now, I would have used another part of the anatomy, but I was told that I should be polite. So I will speak about the spine. And what I mean is that you have two nations here that are both committed to human rights before this term was prostituted by the United Nations, and are willing to use force in order to defend it, who understand that if you want to live in liberty, you must be willing to defend it, that it's not self-evident, that it's not God-given. If you don't fight for liberty, you will lose it. The Europeans don't understand it. Europeans don't understand it. A European gets up in the morning and says, what a beautiful day. Who can I capitulate to today? Okay? Is there an Adolf around? And if not, let's have a Joseph. And if not, at least a Yasser. Anybody. But he must be disgusting, and he must be willing to accept our capitulation. This is Europe since the Great War, the First World War. By the way, even the British elite, not the British government, but even the British elite, particularly the worst part of the British elite, the academic British elite. And I think Americans understand that they have something in common with those people, much smaller than they themselves, who are also willing to use force when it's absolutely necessary to fight against barbarians. And understand that if somebody rains missiles on your cities, you don't approach him with interflora, because maybe he doesn't like 12 roses. You send the Israeli Air Force. Or, in the American case, finally, you start sending drones. Because if somebody is your enemy, you kill him. Okay? This is not a criminal case where you will bring him to justice. You seek him out and you kill him. Because the only way you can deal with these people is to deal with them in a way that they understand. If you're trying to explain that they probably had a difficult childhood, and you ask yourself, what can I do for you? What have I done wrong to bring out your rage? It's too late when he's killing your civilians. You're not trying to be nice. And Americans and Israelis understand it. And Americans know that Israelis deal with it every day. And look at something very interesting. A few years ago, I was speaking here on the Hill, and I was asked, how long will the special relations between the United States and Israel last? And I said, Senator, as long as they're burning Israeli and American flags together, we're in business. Notice this, there isn't a single case where they burn an American flag where they don't burn an Israeli flag. And they know why they're doing it. Because Americans and Israelis have something in common. And the American people appreciate it, and it's reflected in Congress, and it's reflected in the presidency, in the administration. And you may have a president who's more friendly or less friendly, more understanding or less understanding, but the infrastructure is very, 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 very solid and getting better every year. So that's one not so bad news. And here's the second and the most important, the Israeli society. Now, if you want to understand the Israeli society, I suggest the first step would be stop reading the English edition of Haaretz. Because as long as you do, you won't understand anything. If there is one thing that is the opposite of the reality in Israel, it's the English edition of Haaretz. By the way, also the Hebrew edition, but some people here read the English edition of Haaretz. Because Haaretz became an extremely radical paper. It used to be a critical paper. Now it's a radical paper that represents a negligible portion of the Israeli elite and is getting worse every day. And unfortunately, most newspaper men and most media representatives in Israel simply translate the English edition of Haaretz into their respective languages, and then you get it around the world. I'm delighted to say that nothing you can read there is in any way related to the state of Israel and to the Israeli society. And there are two ways to judge it, objectively and subjectively, and both are very important. Objectively, if you look at the three most important issues of Israel, and subjectively, if you ask Israelis how they feel about themselves. Let me start with objectively. Israeli society, Israeli democracy, Israeli economy. Israeli society is unwilling to accept credit for the greatest achievement that you can possibly think of, and one of the great achievements of modern times. We have made an ideology into reality. The ideology was there wasn't a Jewish people. There was no such thing. There was a conglomeration of people who had some idea, those of them who came to Israel because they had other choices. Most people came to Israel because they were kicked out of one place and couldn't get into another. But those who came to Israel had some vague notion that Jews have something in common. But this was an ideology, not a reality. In the last decades, it became a reality. Only 30 years ago, in the 1981 elections, we were on the verge of civil war between Sephardim and Ashkenazi Jews. Okay? 30 years later, today, there are 1 million Israeli children who don't know anymore if they're Sephardic or Ashkenazi because one of their parents is Sephardic and the other is Ashkenazi. The Israeli Central Bureau of Statistics stopped being able to follow people on the basis of Sephardic or Ashkenazi origin because the mixed marriages make it impossible. They're on such a big scale that nobody can trace it anymore. And the three big groups in Israel who were a problem, namely the Oriental Jews, the Russians, and the Yeshuv society, the problem was that nobody could say if they will become one people. They are living in the same place, but if they will become one people. Well, in the last few decades, they became a people. Okay? Now, do we still hate each other? Of course, we enjoy it. Do we still curse each other on an ethnic basis? In Israel, it's fun. Here, it's considered politically incorrect. In Israel, you never meet your best friend without reminding him what is profoundly wrong with an ethnic group. And then people get married. I mean, they are preparing before the marriage to curse each other the way they will anyway after the marriage. So it's a preparatory stage to intermarriages. And it works. You can't argue with success. It works. And this is a tremendous element of strength of the Israeli society. One of the things, by the way, the Arabs were hoping is that the Arab Jews, namely the people who are Arabs by identity and Jews by religion, will not work together with the other Jews. Well, imagine their surprise. It works. And it works in an unbelievable way that the greatest optimist could not have anticipated. Look at the Israeli democracy. We are now in a situation where we occupy another people. I don't like it. Let me identify myself politically to you. I am the great prophet in Israel of unilateralism. I advocate for decades unilateral Israeli getting out of the Gaza Strip and the overwhelming majority of the West Bank. By the way, not because the Palestinians deserve it, they don't. Not because it will bring peace, it won't. But because we don't deserve to cohabitate with them. And I don't want to cohabitate with them. And they say they want us out. I'm delighted. I want out too. Will there be an agreement? No chance. Do I want to do it unilaterally? Yes, very much. Have I succeeded in Gaza? Yes, tremendous success. More terrorism, granted. But an Israeli society without Gaza is stronger than the Israeli society with Gaza. A good enough reason not to be in Gaza. And from time to time, there's a war. Well, we're in the Middle East. This is what happens. Here you have your hurricanes and your mudslides and your earthquakes, and we have a different reason, you know, to be unhappy from time to time. And it's just, you know, it's cold in the winter and hot in the summer, and from time to time, Arabs try to kill us. It's a given. You learn to live in this reality. I'm delighted to say that the majority of the Israelis have learned to live with this reality. But in spite of the occupation, Israel is today much more democratic than 40 years ago, 30 years ago, 20 years ago. Ask an Israeli if he wants to go back to the period before the occupation, before 1967. If he is completely ignorant, he will say yes. But the overwhelming majority of Israelis are not completely ignorant. Now, would it be nicer without the occupation? Yes. My grandmother used to say that it's better to be rich, healthy, and young than sick, old, and poor. If these were the choices of life, I'm for the first collection and not for the second. But look at the Israeli public opinion. And again, if you read newspapers, God forbid, or you listen to journalists, they will tell you Israel has moved to the right. Sorry, it is completely wrong. Israel has moved to the center. What Israelis became over the last 30 years is almost as smart as me. Namely, they have adopted the perception of the right about what the Arabs want to do, and they have adopted the perception of the left about what the Jews need to do. That's the fascinating thing. You have 70% of Israelis who want to repartition the land of Israel between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean. Again, not to get peace. They don't expect it. But because, I'm delighted to say, they don't want to cohabitate with the Palestinians, and they understand that the present situation is bad for Israel, not for peace, for Israel. And at the same time, they completely forgot about the option of peace. In other words, they would have loved to have it, but they realize it's not in the cards. They look around them, they see what is happening in the Arab world, and they say to themselves, let me perhaps tell you a story about it that is very interesting. About 5 years ago, we had the last major demonstration of the peace camp in Israel. Should I stop now? Oh, it's very interesting. Okay, so 10 minutes? Can I schlep it for 10 minutes? Okay, I'll try. And I went to this demonstration. When I go to demonstrations, you know how you identify a sociologist in a strip club. He's the only one looking at the audience, okay? I go to demonstrations because I want to look at the signs that people are carrying. And I see in the largest peace demonstration that there isn't mentioned in any way the word peace. So I called the organizers. I said, only in the name of peace now was there the term shalom. And I asked one of the organizers, I said, I guessed that you instructed people not to carry signs saying peace. And they said, yes, it's true. I said, I want to guess why you did so. Because you want to bring in people from the center of the political spectrum, and you know that when Israelis see peace, they know we are being cheated. And therefore, it wasn't mentioned. And she said, right, this was the reason you haven't seen the word peace. And I think it's a great thing. What you have in Israel is a gravitation towards the center. We have very little real deep left and very little very deep right. Most of the radical right in Israel is ultra-Orthodox. Okay, the people who, in my view, are the curse of the Jewish people in everything, the parasites. Okay, but if you look at the mainstream of Israeli society, you will see that there is very little left and very little right. There is about 2/3 in the center. By the way, including Avigdor Lieberman, who wants to have a Palestinian state. Okay? Not because he loves the Palestinians. I never suspected him of that. But simply because he realizes that it is not good for Israel to sit in the West Bank forever. So what you have in Israel is a more pluralistic society than ever before. I don't think that it's an accident that Tel Aviv is one of the capital cities of homosexuals in the world. The willingness to be open-minded about things in Israel is unbelievable in practically everything. And every year it gets better. Last but not least, the Israeli economy. I remember a period in Israel where we didn't have anything to eat. Today we spend on dieting more than Africa spends on food. Okay? We are in a very good position. This is not a UJA fundraiser, so we can tell the truth. We have a good life. Okay? And we created it by ourselves. If somebody wants to raise questions about it, I'll be delighted to answer. Let me conclude by coming to my overall picture and the net assessment again. First of all, we've had periods 100 times more difficult than today. The 1950s, the 1970s were immeasurably more difficult than today, and the Israeli society was very weak, economically, militarily, internationally. Today, the problems are smaller, and the ability to deal with them is much larger. Second, we have already reached a critical mass where we've proven to ourselves and to others that we can make it in almost every circumstances that you can possibly imagine. Only to give one example, in the last Gaza war, the Israeli stock exchange went up. Where do you see a situation where millions of people are sitting in shelters, 2/3 of the country were sitting in shelters, and the stock exchange goes up? Because everybody knows nothing can destroy the Israeli success, not even a war. Okay? So it is something very important. And last but not least, it is not only that objectively Israel is in a very good place, subjectively there is one public opinion poll in Israel that people don't give enough significance to. Every public opinion poll is done with 508 people, and it is financed by the newspapers. So you know what it's worth. The Central Bureau of Statistics has every year a public opinion poll of 33,500 people. And they ask people, how do you feel about the country? And how do you feel about yourself? And they say to them, is Israel in a good situation? And everybody says no. And then you say, but how are you doing? He says, I'm doing fine. Everything is great. I have great hopes for the future. And when the overwhelming majority says that they have a great life, the fact that they have been conditioned to say that Israel is in a bad situation is okay, but immaterial, because there is something profoundly wrong about Jews. A Jew can only feel good if he feels bad. Okay? So if you realize, if you neutralize this element, and you ask people, are you having a good life? And do you expect an even better life? They give you a positive answer. Last, I want to tell a joke. And it's not funny. But I suppose the lecture you'll forget and the joke you'll remember. And I love the joke. And it represents everything that I said here this evening. The joke is about the Almighty being sick and tired of the human race and deciding to bring a flood. But, comme il faut, wie es sich gehört, a real flood, no Noah, no ark, no olive branch, no dove, just. And he calls the leaders of the three monotheistic religions and he says, go to your people and tell them that in 2 weeks it's over. So the Christian leader comes and says, we have sinned. We have 2 weeks to do good deeds and to pray. And then maybe they'll let us into the pearly gates. The Muslim comes to his community and he says, we've been so perfect, let's do it for 2 more weeks. And the Israeli comes and says, guys, we have 2 weeks to learn how to live underwater. Thank you.